Hallo. Hallo, hallo. Das funktioniert, oder?
Is it working? Great, okay.
Ja? Is that plugged in? Cool. Well, danke and
Thank you very much.
for being here. Thank you to Studio Bonn and Koya Reichardt, the Kunstmuseum Bonn and Kunsthalle Bonn and the Akademie der Künste. We're very psyched to be here this weekend and to be starting off this conference, which is really quite a feat. We wanted to first give a little bit of background as to who we are, just following what Koya was saying. I, as Koya mentioned, worked as the editor-in-chief of Texte, Kunst and Art Forum. I have a long history in magazines. I'm very invested in what has happened to legacy media. And Julian?
I spent most of my career in the music industry, both as a music producer and a DJ and a video director, as well as being involved in the early years of online content creation and niche internet cultures.
But Julian and I, we share a common experience, and it's likely one that we share with many of you here and also listening remotely. The implosion of legacy media structures over the past 2 decades, with the shift from top-down publishing and broadcasting to a decentralized distribution of social media. So there's our glacier melting this summer. As everyone in this room likely is keenly aware, this change in media has completely altered the terms of attention and ultimately, therefore, cultural power. So it's our belief that to speak critically about culture today, one must first establish a clear understanding of how culture circulates, or to understand, as Julian likes to say,
the physics of contemporary media, the affordances and limitations, the laws that govern traction, speed, visibility, and even permanence of an idea or piece of content. Do you want to switch spaces with me?
The slides. Okay.
So the physics of contemporary media follow the physics of social media platforms inherently. I use the term physics to describe the user interface design, the uniformity of how posts appear, the character limits that keep posts short, the platform's gamified mechanics and incentives, collecting likes and followers, and the priorities of its recommendation algorithms, increasing time spent on the platform through engagement, whether positive or negative. From these physics, which influence every aspect of communication and behavior on the platforms, physics are laws that sort of they define everything else that emerges from them. Very unexpected and particular effects emerge. The nth order effects of the social media system. These effects include our own cognitive and emotional responses, releases of dopamine, cortisol, and adrenaline, crowd dynamics and peer pressure of all kinds. And a few orders out, the recent surge of right-wing populism and the dis, and malinformation boom. But this is outside of the scope of our conversation.
It's our feeling that even though most people are now more or less aware that social media can be corrosive, or that, as scholars like Shoshana Zupoff and Akila Mbembe and others have argued, contemporary media turns its audience, really its user base, into a lucrative, unpaid labor force, that we do not yet have a common map of what we make as artists, as writers, as critics, publishers, academics, how it actually exists within today's field of media.
So what we hope to do in the next 30 minutes is to think about where, as cultural producers, we live, and to provide some working coordinates for how, in our observation, criticism relates to its media infrastructure in this year, 2022.
Okay, so first, let's just quickly revisit the long-standing model. Many of you will be familiar with this. In our minds, many of us may have an image of a public sphere as Jürgen Habermas defined it, a social formation emerging in the 18th century that is conceptually distinct from the state, a site for the production and circulation of discourses that can, in principle, be critical of the state. And since it is also in principle distinct from the official economy, it is not, I'm quoting here scholar Nancy Fraser, her 1990 essay, Rethinking the Public Sphere, it is not an arena of market relations, but rather one of discursive relations, a theater for debating and deliberating rather than buying and selling. We know that this theater for debating and deliberating is enormously important to the rise of what we call the art world, right? As Thomas Crow wrote about the Paris Salon, pictured here, the Paris Salon of 1785, as captured by Pietro Antonio Martini, it, quote, brought together, this is Thomas Crow, it, quote, brought together a broad mix of classes and social types, where exhibitions were thus faced with the task of defining what sort of public it had brought into being. So we know that it was in this context that the art critic emerged, and the art critic's task was ultimately to triangulate the work with the zeitgeist of its public viewers, and whatever contemporaneous political, economic conditions the critic deemed important. So that was the critic's job, to suture these three things: the public, the art, and whatever else was going on publicly, politically or economically. In this way, the critic would assign value, which would anchor further debate about the value of certain signs and aesthetic moods, and quite often also personalities. But the corollary model of this public sphere was contingent on a particular form of media. We often call this legacy media. I mean, we often call this legacy media or 20th century media. But really what we're talking about is unidirectional or top-down media, whether print or radio or TV. This was more or less the working model for dominant media until the early 2000s. And you can see here, I'm sorry this is in English, but maybe our wonderful simul translators can also read this in German. So we have the event stimulus, that's an art exhibition or a news event. The critic journalist writes about it. The legacy media validates it, publishing it to the public sphere, where it is received by the audience. And really, the critic journalist is part of this public sphere, but for the sake of a diagram, you know, all models are wrong, some are just more or less useful. We have it organized this way. Oops.
If we were to draw a structural diagram of the public sphere in the age of 24/7 digitally networked global media, we might end up with something like Benjamin Bratton's 20 Teens diagram of the stack as a more useful model. In other words, it is no longer a shared physical room, but layers of physical and digital containers and protocols that together give the illusion of a shared digital space. And in this Bratton model of the stack, media is fundamentally not linear. It is holographic, or perhaps even just a kind of amorphous slime or lubricant that allows information to be transmitted across the layers.
In turn, this means that there is effectively no longer a mainstream. Media is now dispersed. I mean, as we see, you know, this is the American West. Any dam needs a large force of water behind it and an altitude drop to generate power. But most content now is created and published either before it reaches a legacy media reservoir or it transpires well downstream from the legacy gates. You could think of content maybe as having evaporated from the mainstream, stored and circulated via the so-called cloud, where it can be precipitated and devirtualized by anyone at any time.
A quick word about the cloud. We may think of the cloud as being everywhere, but in fact, the cloud is a non-place. The cloud is nowhere. The cloud is a fantasy of a homogeneous, largely English-speaking planet where geographic, historical, and cultural differences are subsumed by an individual freedom untethered from local realities. Imagining yourself flying through a cloud offers a good metaphor, as our skydiver is doing here, with all sense of scale and direction erased by an endless glowing fog. You can move effortlessly anywhere you like without ever being oriented to exactly where you are.
But more accurately and literally, of course, the cloud exists within populated places as data centers and cable hubs and is deliberately unlisted. The cloud is not a physical common space like the Paris Salon, right? And as we'll show, it's not a digital commons either. Okay, but we digress. We want to take a minute and diagram what this shift from linear to nonlinear media looks like. In a way, you all know this story already, but I think there's value in giving us a common visual model to hold in mind during this conference. So linear media looks like this. And the place where legacy media releases information to its audience is the key zone. This is the proverbial mainstream dam. This is the PowerPoint and is where advertising or sponsorship credit lines and critique have coexisted for the past 2 centuries.
In linear media, there's a very clear attention zone. This zone is valuable for everyone involved. It exists as an energy point with a shared common space or public sphere.
But linear media's power starts to visibly atrophy by the early 2010s as smartphones become ubiquitous and Web 2 social media platforms prioritize their mobile apps. You now have the rise of the citizen journalist. Think Tahrir Square, think Occupy Wall Street, who, with smartphones in hand and 3G-enabled Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and Vine, have everything that a journalist needs to self-publish her own small stream. The legacy media and the brands that communicate via these mainstream channels, circa 2012, they want to believe that their official attention zone is the only one that really matters, right? They're the professional attention zone, the only one with true gravitas.
But of course, this is less true with every passing day. Attention is fracturing, and readers are increasingly likely to first encounter a piece of legacy media reposted and re-editorialized by another user on social media.
So at this point, we're thinking or kidding ourselves that mostly chronological and that legacy media and big platforms are a virtual public sphere. We're thinking about it as that kind of space. But at this point, social media is still mostly chronological, and it's still mostly populated by people that we actually know or know of. But if we take Habermas's conception of the public sphere, i.e., as a place where private individuals come together to debate matters of the state and the economy, unencumbered by their professional identities, we have a fundamental problem. In 2009, Twitter instituted the blue check mark, verifying the identity of public figures. Public figures, journalists, politicians, celebs, would then appear on social media in their official capacity. Now, this isn't terribly different from an IRL situation when a celeb has maybe courtside seats at a basketball game, American reference, but you know. They are by default appearing in official capacity.
But as blue checks start using social media as their primary venue, the epic merging of Kim Kardashian and Kanye West as it played out on social media platforms is arguably more memorable than any single episode of Keeping Up with the Kardashians. Private persons are also nudged to engage in professional capacities.
So we may wonder why an elite journalist would start splitting their energy between legacy media and lowly social media. In part, this is because in the eyes of legacy media, which is starting to feel its status slipping, you know, as the teens start going on.
Or maybe been.
Yeah, or maybe been. Journalists with higher social media numbers have more security in their legacy media jobs. Validated by the mega platforms, they are perceived as more valuable by legacy media. And at this point, legacy media actually needs the network effects of big on social media journalists to drive traffic to their own sites. But there's another reason why journalists are increasingly splitting their energy between paid legacy media jobs and social media. Massive decline in journalistic pay. In the 1960s, top magazines, okay, only a handful, but top magazines would pay what is adjusted for 2022 inflation $10 a word for a premiere feature.
Also adjusted for 2022 inflation, I think that's just 10 euros a word as well.
Exactly, probably is. By the 1980s, Condé Nast would pay top writers what is, again, adjusted for inflation, $6 a word. So your 3,000 word feature would pay $18,000. Let's say you write 2 major features a year, that's $36K, and let's say you adjunct teach, bringing in maybe $60,000 a year. That's like at least a modest, livable middle-class income, especially if you're living outside of New York or London, right? Today, the rate for top journalists in the top magazines pays $3 a word. Most pay far less. According to various articles addressing the devaluation of journalism, the going rate is about 25 cents per word. This is roughly the rate The Guardian pays, for instance, 150 for about 600 words, maybe more. Many magazines cash-strap themselves, never actually pay, as we can attest, sending exclusive merch instead, or promising list spots at high-profile parties, which you're going to pay your own, plane, flight, and hotel. In any case, $150 for about 600 words. Meanwhile, in academia, there used to be a kind of meritocratic creed where doing it for the money was crass, and writing instead in the name of discourse, regardless of pay, would advantageously position you for academic jobs, editorial board seats, and other professional opportunities. But over the past 10 years, the entire system has broken down. For more academic regions, the pool of meritocratic rewards has dwindled, in part because of older generations remaining in their teaching positions later in age, thereby opening fewer spaces for younger scholars. In part because institutions themselves have grown weaker in the wake of social media and their validation is less compelling. And in part because public funding for the arts has shrunk, at least in America. I know it's not quite as severe here, but still, it has shrunk. Or it's been directed towards specific diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, which is great. However, it further narrows the range of what could potentially be funded. Meanwhile, the low pay in other journalistic regions has led to a decline in quality, as good writers literally cannot afford to take on these assignments. The brain drain from the industry has resulted in weaker discourse and a pervasive sense that being a writer or journalist is not even a real job. Because, let's face it, as a writer, you would need to pen roughly 365 Guardian articles a year to clear an annual income of $55,000. And if there's a Guardian person in the audience who wants to correct me on the statistic, I would love to know that, but that's what we found through our research.
Do you write 365 articles?
No, obviously it's totally impossible. Okay. So writers looking to maximize their return on investment will share their legacy media work in parallel to social media, engaging with commenters and other blue checks to grow the article's traction and to grow their own algorithmic visibility. Web2 platforms reward engagement with greater exposure in hopes of being considered for other more lucrative gigs.
This leads to a phenomenon called audience capture. Paid in attention, the critic becomes captured by their audience and prioritizes subject matter that maximizes attention, retains or pleases an existing audience, and especially does not jeopardize their reputation. We used to criticize writers who would write a fawning catalog essay for a mediocre artist if paid a high enough fee. Yet today we applaud writers who get maximal attention for so-called positions that we know are ideological and driven by an intentionally valuable mimetic wave. And it's not so much that one colleague has a bad take, it's that this protocol, the physics, is contributing to an environment where no work is truly valued and no one can truly think.
Okay, this is obviously a ridiculous slide, but however we map the flows of information across to name media outlets now, the resulting visual is going to be completely untenable. I was reading recently that ride-sharing and delivery apps will soon be implementing programmatic advertising alongside light editorial content. So we already have retail outlets generating marketing material formatted as legacy print magazines, and suffice it to say that media no longer functions linearly. This is compliments of do not research Joshua Citarella, this emoji, so credits due. Media no longer functions linearly, and so by extension, neither can criticism. So it's really important. This is the world in which your criticism exists. It's not tenable. So, oh yeah, should I say this now? I forget. The working title for this presentation was, Do You Know Where You Live? In the sense that before one can know where they stand, wo stehst du, Kollege, famous Immendorf, one must first know where they live, what the physics are for the world they inhabit. Before you can take a position, you have to know what you're standing on, right? Okay, so to recap.
Content no longer flows linearly. Media has become holographic. Content is cheap. Audience capture is real. So where therein can the critic stand?
Wo stehst du, Kollege, in another sense. So, and we should be quicker because I think we have only 10 minutes. Oh my gosh. Okay, so so if that was aiming at establishing the transition to nonlinear media, and what that's done to the public sphere. Now we want to think about what happens to a piece of content or criticism as it flows through this holographic web. I'm not so sure you can see it, but we tried to put VR masks on all of these Paris salon visitors, so that's what that is. Anyway, here is a widely circulated image of two Stop Oil activists at London's National Gallery. You all know the story. The activists have thrown tomato soup onto the protective glass of a painting and superglued their hands to the museum's wall. The painting, of course, is by Van Gogh, one of the most famous of his 1888 Sunflower series. Looked great in the 80s too, though. This direct action is not critiquing the painting, not directly, and nor is it really critiquing accumulated wealth, although maybe that's like a vibration of this. Rather, it uses the iconicity of Van Gogh's sunflowers to amplify Stop Oil's message, imbuing Stop Oil's message with maximally mediagenic traction. To be sure, it instrumentalizes and thereby endorses the painting's mimetic power as a way of ensuring visibility of Stop Oil protesters' own message. And we say this not to place any judgment on the activists. We have no strong opinions about their protest. What we think is interesting is how well it demonstrates the underlying truth of how a piece of critical content circulates today. So, in a media system where
criticism is neither independently valued nor efficiently distributed, many critical acts operate according to this logic, to a greater or lesser degree.
And, wait, where are we? Okay. So in a media system where attention is deeply fractured, high recognition entities become a kind of public commons, an algorithmically successful sign capable of linking the largest number of informational attentional silos. So you can extrapolate this outward to how legacy media entities program content. For instance, Beyonce has, to date, been nominated for more than 1,000 awards. Like, her awards have their own Wikipedia pages. I actually counted to 1,000 and then I stopped. And I think she was nominated for the new Grammys too. Anyway, her awards have their, at this point, she is the one who's now giving credibility to the award shows. And it's the same way with a piece of content. A piece of content that's powerful enough lends credibility and traction to the publication. In any case, so we might think of Beyonce as a place, one that is conceptually distinct from the state. She is a site in the form of a hashtag or keyword for the production and circulation of discourses that can, in principle, be critical of the state. Algorithmically, Beyonce becomes a place, a data set that is shared by a comparatively large and diverse group of people. According to the laws of the platform, the most valuable criticism is similar to the most attentionally valuable art, content that can be instrumentalized for downstream parties to maximize visibility and increase social standing.
I want to do a quick comparison here. Pokemon Go is a multiplayer online augmented reality mobile game which uses real-world events and locations as the arena for gameplay or engagement. But I also think about Twitter and Instagram working in this exact same way. In both, you interact with other real-world events and users. In both, the platform rewards your engagement, how long you spend on it. However, in one, you collect small monsters called Pokemon, and in the other, you collect followers. In Pokemon Go, you use Pokeballs to catch the monsters. On Twitter and Instagram, you use content to catch followers.
Right. Well, criticism requires a certain set of conditions to function. It needs enough space for complexity and, or per Habermas, a space that's built for discursive relations, not market relations. It needs a theater for debating and deliberating rather than buying and selling. But social media is, by its structure, built around attention market relations. We are not private persons in this space. Platform physics and gamification require us to align with the platform's interests. And any activity going against the platform's interests, as some in this room probably already know, the platform will devalue, punishing the offending user with warning, shadow banning, deleted posts, suspensions, or full-out bans.
Excuse me for going fast here, but I think we have to. Ported to social media, a critique must align with the platform interests through compression. Otherwise, it'll be rendered invisible or prohibited outright. Compression discards everything but the thesis of a critique, so it becomes a slogan, aphorism, or infographic. And once posted, the compressed critique not only informs or just communicates, it serves as a script that executes engagement. The more divisive a critique, the more engagement it will receive, and the more likely it is to spark a flywheel of algorithmic amplification. But compression often results in strange and unintended interpretations downstream. For instance, when an important and nuanced argument is reduced to a essentializing buzzword, it can be appropriated and deployed to add emphasis or viral power to any unrigorous argument. We see this, for example, with the ever-growing hashtagable calls to decolonize, which sometimes ignore cultural and geographic nuances, as noted by philosopher Olufemi Taiwo. Similarly, there can be an inherent coloniality of the LGBTQI categorical framework when it's being downloaded from the Anglophone cloud into certain cultures where fluid sexual identity that didn't ask for nor need these Western categories. This is discussed by Jordanian academic Joseph Massad. How do you write LGBTQI in a non-Latin script? Decolonizing the cloud seems like a very worthy project. And on social media, criticism can serve as a substrate for sport politic, dopamine and adrenaline-charged gamified debate, essentializing or universalizing hot takes, scolding and outrage between adversarial ideological teams. And it all takes place in the orientationless nowhere of the cloud in front of a numberless, often anonymous audience. As I mentioned in our introduction, the physics of a platform shapes everything within it and emerging from it. Critique and discourse on social media will always be compressed and compromised, warped and shaped by the platform physics.
Effectively, this game of compressed critique and sport politic becomes a stand-in for the critical sphere. In this scenario, we see the critic dutifully writing a thoughtful critique in a legacy publication. They're out of the loop, while social media-propelled takes garner popular attention. Legacy publications, meanwhile, will either accept a position of lower traction or will try to engage with debates that have viral potential. Effectively, though, Web 2 social media becomes the medium via which the entire legacy apparatus runs. And as we know, Web 2 platforms profit from user engagement, regardless of the quality of the content. On these platforms, high visibility becomes the marker of critical success.
But a desire to escape from these platform physics, and by extension, the physics of capital, has driven the growing decentralized dark forest ecosystems of publishing, discourse, criticism, and collecting too.
Increasingly, we see channels developing beyond the index ClearNet, and by that we mean the main social media platforms, anything that can, anything that's Google searchable, say.
So we see this on Discord,
Yeah.
WhatsApp, Telegram, Signal, and Substack.
And we see this both among artist groups like Do Not Research or New Models, but we also see this among collectors. Social media is draining, limiting, exposing, and unchic. I mean, a lot of art advisors and gallerists would much rather just have a DM group with their collectors than post their show on Instagram. It's quite embarrassing, actually. So you can see this graph here where you see two worlds departing from the ClearNet space. Right, but this move from ClearNet to Dark Forest has some challenges of its own, primarily the fact that it isolates off-platform communities. While Web 2 is a false commons, no clear digital commons yet exists, or has yet to be broadly adopted beyond social media. Meanwhile, the experience of being on Web 2 is increasingly alienating, as bots, suggested accounts, and ads populated by programmatic advertising protocols fill an ever larger part of the Web 2 space. There is this increasing sense of emptiness.
Of course, as a view from which this move to smaller, more local online communities appears as a further breakdown of our public sphere. But then one must ask, for what citizens is the public sphere of social media for? Citizens of the cloud? Is the cloud a state? If so, it's a corporatocracy located nowhere and thus chiefly serving discussions related to the politics of its own simulation-bound existence. When it comes to our earthbound reality, the public sphere informed by legacy media has been hollowed out, and the illusion of a commons we are now left with is that of a cloud state where nobody actually lives.
When it comes to art criticism, social media is not where the conversation should be happening. Critical discourse must be insulated from aims of scaling audience and the metrics of clicks and engagement. Discourse that is pegged to the attention economy cannot be autonomous, let alone truly critical. Challenging discourse cannot succeed in the scale game of social media, and that should be fine.
The fact that social media prioritizes the metrics of attention and invisibilizes all others is well-worn territory. And judging art by these metrics is strange indeed. According to ArtNet's top 300 most popular artists measured by clicks, two photographers from the 1980s known for their Vaseline lens shots of nude adolescent girls remain the internet's two favorite artists, apparently, followed by Sally Mann and Diane Arbus and Andy Warhol. Within this attention economy, more spectacular and limbically charged art criticism and activism does succeed, largely around products of undoing. Think of the scandal surrounding Documenta, Berlin Biennale, and the past two Whitney biennials. We do not wish to question the merit of these projects, but we do question what will fill the vacuum left after so much undoing, such as in the critical canon, when the neoliberal digital cloud by its nature seems to flow in and fill every vacuum with its own capital-driven emptiness. Amid all this undoing, cultural criticism could benefit from some rebuilding, particularly in regards to its own currency. Is there a way to create a signal powerful enough to have influence within the attention economy without being warped by its physics? We think there is, by making art criticism a place where people want to be after an alienating COVID lockdown spent alone in the cloud. Our project New Models is a place, a virtual place, but we also devirtualize it to show that the community indeed exists. And Arts of the Working Class, a Berlin-based street newspaper publishing texts in multiple languages, gives a place to a distributed multinational community.
While every arts institution is also a place, they often are not at liberty to move with agility. And so one of the most valuable things they can do is to support the organic dark forests that are their digital and oftentimes geographic neighbors. To look not just for individual artists that fit certain bureaucratic social initiatives, but for artist communities, or even just creative communities, which are very often organically diverse.
Legacy institutions have real estate, and legacy media have the means of platformless production. If these entities can pair with dark forest communities outside of Web 2 physics, if they can support devirtualizing generative digital local communities, then they can help to connect isolated digital enclaves by holding space for them apart from the cloud.
We might ask what the next era of media will be. Our hope is that we can think about dark forest communities as media.
This conference, of course, is a great example of making criticism a place people want to be. Notably, Kolya had the brilliant idea that this place of art criticism should have an after party with bang techno till 3 a.m. That is one way you make it a place people want to be. And now that you know the stakes, you all have to stay to the end. Because FOMO, fear of missing out, has a strong pull in the attention economy. It's a slower burn than posting about NFTs, rest in peace, but FOMO is how the real reminds the simulated which one truly has higher resolution, which one has 5 senses, and which has a paltry 2. By rebuilding a rich, interesting, and exciting public sphere that is driven by communities rather than the cloud, criticism can regain the intrigue and influence it's been losing when it started to forget where it lived.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carly. Thank you, Julian. That was amazing. That was fast. I don't know how you feel. I have one question before we sit down, the three of us. If I can choose one slide.
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
Any, here.
Could it be
Don't escape.
2022?
2022?
Because there was a lot to look at, and it would be interesting.
Is this the
to talk
hell
about it in
slide?
detail.
This or this?
The white one.
Okay. Oh, God,
wow.
I'm sorry.
This is where we live, right?
It's Carly's
As
masterpiece.
far as I
Yeah.
understood. Maybe we make like ginger, blonde ginger.
Sure.
Yeah,
sure.
good idea.
Thank you.
Okay.
Amazing. I mean, my train. I'm talking about trains because people were stuck in trains yesterday.
Our
and
train was
today.
like that yesterday,
My brain
yeah.
trained. My brain was trained with your podcast over the past 2 years. I learned so much about NFTs, about how the public sphere changed. You have such an amazing roster of people you invite. We stole a few from you, not many, but like Joshua Citarella, who's talking later in the panel about memes versus museums, who just had a rest upstairs after coming in from New York. He was also recently in your podcast.
Yeah.
And don't think of New Models as a podcast that accelerates everything. I mean, those guys are talking really quick and fast. But you could, for example, also hear Joshua Citarella make like a strong statement for museums and institutions.
Yeah.
And being a public institution in Germany usually means you're a federal institution. You're paid by the city, by the federal state. This institution is paid by all the federal states and managed by the central state, which for us, setting up discursive programs like Studio Bonn always puts up the question, what kind of lens do we look through? What questions can we raise? Having you as an example for a dark forest ambition in the central institution is great to open this conference. That's what I quickly wanted to say. There's occasion to ask questions in about 5 minutes, but I have like 2 questions to Carly and Julian.
Sorry.
Is this the reason why the last summer was very stressful for many people? Is this the reason why it was hard to speak about judgments about Documenta or even to agree on what kind of object Documenta is, what its shape is, what its responsibilities are? Is this the reason that it's hard to even relate to the same object?
I would say absolutely. I mean, somebody said before the Russian war in Ukraine escalated that Ukraine felt like a kind of porridge because the communication systems were so unclear and there were so many different messages and counter messages. And that was like this kind of hell one had to endure, of course, before the material hell that broke out. And not to compare the two, obviously that situation is far more severe, but I think that sense of porridge does describe...
What, sorry?
Porridge, like oatmeal.
Bertram muesli.
Yeah, Bertram muesli.
Yeah.
It's like, that's like our media reality. And I don't think we know how to value things. I think we all feel devalued in that space. I mean, of course, speaking as someone whose like career has been invested in this for a long time, but I don't think we can think clearly. And I do think it's a real crisis. and that we only find clarity within groups, physical groups that we can know, that we can interact with in real space, ideally.
Or, I mean, just smaller online groups where there's really mutual trust, and disagreement can end with like a resolution or a new understanding, I think. I think one thing that was interesting about Carly undertaking this project is I don't think most people wouldn't even attempt to map this, because it's sort of a Sisyphean task to try anyways. It really is, it is impossible, actually, I think, or we need a much bigger screen. Once you do just take a moment to try to map the flows of influence, incentives, like the physics, as I call it, and how it actually works, and where all these nudges are coming from, you really start to be aware of how the social media platforms shape our discussion, and also makes discussions with a bit more conflict and nuance, and a lot of valid differing opinions, like the conversations around Documenta. It's a terrible venue for it, because there's too many exploits, I think, that actually aren't good for discussion or critique, that can be enacted, and often are. I mean, they're very easy, and people can get rewarded by them, but they are not helpful to critique. It's just a wrong,
I thought about exits. I thought about counterexamples while listening to you, and I thought about exit strategies. You presented one, and we are in the middle of it, I guess.
Yeah.
Like option A. Option B: stay at home, put out your phone, buy a newspaper, sit down and read the newspaper. That was something that wasn't really having a place in your presentation, and especially in relation to Documenta, I always think about this Die Zeit article that came out just 5 days after Taring Padi's scandalous, weird, until today not really explained, huge painting was revealed and then
Removed,
clad and disassembled. Die Zeit had in the culture section in the Feuilleton on page 1 a long article showing the whole thing with the cloth also hiding half of it. And a really like slow contextualization of everything, like telling about the background, how it was made, what is actually to see on the painting. They didn't mention so much the other racist depictions that also were on this painting, but there was an image description without like making a final judgment, and just having this material laid out and having it put in a place slowly created a different space of like calming down and really thinking about it. So could one exit out of this script that you talked about, that criticism is taking place, just be like the classic discipline of criticism, description? Like slow, patient description of things?
I mean, in a vacuum, of course, that's the ideal. But I don't think we live in a world where that's going to be possible for any majority, a bourgeois majority, a student majority. I just don't think that that's a realistic expectation. I think it's an ideal, and we can think of ways of creating instances of it. Like, for instance, any dark forest, whether that's an academic group or whether that's an artist group, they can create their own publications that function according to that. But I think en masse, I don't think we can put the genie back in the bottle. So, but yes, that is the ideal. I really appreciate the written description of a work of art. I mean, it's why I love Thomas Crowe's work, right? I mean, it's just like butter reading his description of these old masters. It's amazing, right? And you engage with the painting so much, or the artwork so much differently. But I don't think it's realistic en masse. But I don't know.
It was just a try.
Yeah, it's a great.
Are
It
there
should be
any
the
questions
ideal.
from the audience? I think we have about 5 minutes left to the next break. We have a microphone in the middle, in the front. Please come up front. Yeah, I'm really sorry that you have to make all the way. Yeah, you can take any way. You can walk around.
Does it work? Yeah.
All right, we have one
Okay.
here.
Thank you for this very dense speech you made, very fast. You were training my English very much. Thank you. Nevertheless, I'll ask myself if if it doesn't go too far. In fact, to me, your speech was describing the nowadays communication sphere as a whole and the media sphere, and in a sense, but we're dealing about a very, very tiny fraction of that, which is art critic. Art, not only the arts, fine arts, but also any other theater, music, and so on, which has always been limited to a very small part of the public, which has always been published in either legacy media, as you call them, we call them Leitmedien in Germany, or in very specialized elitist media with a very small number of circulation. So I wonder if this graphic we can see in behind of you isn't erroneous, because 3/4 of that what you're showing to us does not refer to art critic. That refers to mass media, to the general public, to how themes today are said and reposted and commented and so on, but has nothing to do with art critic. So could you please try to focus the range of your ideas a little bit more on art criticism in sui generis, and not only speaking about new models? Thank you.
Yes, I mean, thank you for your question. And because it gives me an opportunity to say that the value of that small sliver, that like elite aspirational sliver, was contingent on it in the wider popular imaginary having a kind of cachet. I mean, we can think of like any cinematic depiction of the art world that's depicting the 50s or the 60s or the 70s or the 80s or the 90s, always shows the art world as this highly desirable, even if sometimes like, spoofed or like a caricatured zone of intense value production. I would argue that due to this media environment, that's no longer the case. And I know that that's probably not a popular take, but I do not think, especially among younger people, that the art world is like a very seductive place with a lot of cachet. I think that because of this, it has been massively diffused, and I don't think that that image we had of the dam and how there was a PowerPoint and how linear media enabled that PowerPoint, it also enabled that kind of cachet around an art world. And I just don't think that exists. I don't think there is like a Cologne of the 90s right now that is gate-kept by legacy media. I just don't think there is. I would love to know about it. So, and maybe this is my barrier with languages. Probably it does exist in certain cultures, but in our Western, Americanized, colonial, digital exported cloud, I don't see it. And I mourn it because it was something I grew up with. So that's why we chose not to speak about a small sliver. But I know it's not the case for everybody. We're just speaking about what we've experienced.
I mean, I would also say, though, as it was a small sliver and sort of in these specialist journals or certain legacy publications, I mean, the idea or the aspiration would always be to have it reach more people, right?
Well, that was the dream of the aughts. With
right.
like the art world was like a handmaiden to globalization, and that was something that, while of course empire is scary and bad, we should be excited about having a global art community. And of course, it is exciting. It is exciting to be communicating with our Chinese counterparts. That's like really cool. That's a great thing. It felt the Hans Ulrich Obrist, the Molly Nesbitt's, the Okwui and Weezors, this idea that we exist in a global society. So that was the aspiration that our generation in particular identified with. And when that didn't work out, there was a great loss.
Well, I also think, though, in our conclusion, I mean, what we're suggesting, honestly, is a way of bringing sort of more rigorous or sincere good art criticism actually to a broader audience, where we kind of leapfrog the subject a bit, but it also presents a way to both sort of maintain the rigor of this sort of specialized practice, but also expand it to more people by making it a sexier place, with 3 a.m. parties. Thank you.
Is there like Sorry, is there an audience question? Please. I was quick asking the next question, but just so exciting being a former art critic myself.
Hi, hello everybody. First of all, new codex shout out.
Oh,
right.
And I wanted to ask you about the economic base of cultural production, because you were talking about how the dynamics of the Web 2 platforms are basically because of the dynamics of capital accumulation. And if I understand you correctly, you kind of suggest return to a federally funded, or in some cases philanthropic model through the cooperation with museums, and that museums could help bootstrap dark forest communities. And is that what you're suggesting, or maybe I know you're also invested in this Web3 community funding structure with Channel, and what are your thoughts maybe on other paths for alternative economic structures for cultural production, suggested in Internet for the People by Ben Tarnoff, Platform Socialism by James Muldoon, or maybe in a long shot connected to the Vergesellschaftungsbewegung, movement for socialization of different kind of infrastructures in Germany, and yeah.
Communalization, you could maybe say.
Communalization.
Right? Mm.
I mean, I say everything, as if anything that you can access is fair game. And I think community funded is fantastic, because in our experience, when subscribers become members, they then have a conceptual investment in the project and contribute in a way that's invaluable, that goes even further in a sense than their dollars. I think that a lot of institutions, especially in Europe, they do have budgets that are already allocated or already there to be allocated. So why not connect dark forests and institutions? They need programming. Dark forests need some kind of baseline support that allows them to do more, even just to connect with other dark forests, right? So those two are good. Web3, I mean, we're going through a weird period with crypto, but I do think that the mechanics of Web3 will do some really interesting things in terms of allowing us to find each other and to organize ourselves.
Things that have nothing to do with speculation.
Things that have nothing to do with
be
speculation.
Clear, the most boring part that no one ever really hears about is actually the most interesting.
And the idea of owning a token, having that token appreciate as a community appreciates, I mean, that's still fair game, but to do it in a speculative way, I think is dead in the water.
Yeah, what you're talking about with platform socialism and all of these, the ideas and the ideas being developed around other ways of funding communities and making it sort of taking back the internet away from these centralized behemoths with these really toxic physics, I think is really, really important work that should have more attention and does need to be done. I think it was just too big of a box for us to open with this talk.
It's super interesting territory. Would love
and
to
incredibly important.
Exactly, incredibly important.
I can recommend the Studio Bonn recording of Who Controls the Bundeskunsthalle, when Hito Style had minted the Bundeskunsthalle as NFT in the name of the people and brought two blockchain collectives, Department of Decentralization and Other Internet, who also Dina Jaego, who speaks later, who works with.
Yeah.
And they presented models of blockchain governance for cultural institutions. We also had our CEO presenting how such an institution like this works and how complicated it is, the system of checks and balances with the government, and we also saw the limits of connecting dark forest and the public institution. We are bound by law to work on that old model of broadcasting our content, also via social media, hoping for an audience to come and buy tickets. The dynamics that you talk about is diffusing or distributing producer and consumer or ownership, right? Give people a share in the platform you're building. That's also what you're trying to do with Channel, who we cannot go into far enough. But that's what I understand from you, to really get people out of quiet quitting attitudes.
Yeah.
They need incentives, right?
Yeah.
And they need maybe also incentives in a kind of gamified surrounding, where they feel they can build something, no?
I think depending. I don't want to do a cosign of gamification without knowing the details.
Right.
But I mean, I would say maybe something more generally though to mention is that I mean Elon Musk bought Twitter and is running it into the ground. Zuck had a delusion of the metaverse being something people wanted, and everyone was like not interested, and now he's running Meta into the ground. I mean, this is a time that really, in far more ways than the internet or social media, it feels like a bit apocalyptic, or very much like things are collapsing, and that from this stage things will be rebuilt. But it's that very early stage, I think, where the opportunity to do so is here. And I think, when it comes to actually concrete, what is going to succeed, what models are going to be the best to deploy, we're still in an experimentation phase.
I'm so excited for the next 10 days also, especially for the take of John Miller and Julieta Aranda, who will have a one-on-one keynote on the 25th in Berlin and have their own take, I think, on how the platform economy has changed criticism. Or like, where's the public sphere in the metaverse with Hito Style and Matt Dryhurst and Niklas Mark, who just wrote a book on server farms. I thought of this when I showed the architecture, chaired by Joshua Sedorella. What we thought, like why we do this conference, is also the public sphere emerged out of like scholarly conversations about literature, art, and theater, right? Like before political judgment was distributed in parliaments and voting, it was distributed in cafes, like bourgeois dark forests, you could call them. If today many things feel like perspectives is being lost, or like you don't really know what things mean and they get blurry. I had that feeling at Art Cologne this week. Could criticism and could like the engaged conversation about what we actually have in front of us and the development of perspectives, could that help? Like to give a fundament, to have any judgment at all?
I think a lot of podcasts try to do that.
It's a question for the place of the arts in the public, right? Kind of. Yeah.
Are you asking like what venue would be the space for criticism? Or are you just asking, does criticism have like a place? Because yes, of course, absolutely it does. It's like,
I mean, I put a question, but it's maybe like a rhetorical question.
Yeah.
There's no perspective without criticism, right?
Yeah.
Thank you. Lil Internet will also be DJing tonight.
Yes.
From 12 after Eric de Klerk at Judgment Night. And thank you both very much.
Cool.
We will go back to the Barbara Kruger work, Cast of Characters, which we hadn't mentioned before, which is the usual background. Cast of Characters was first used also in a conference format in Kunsthalle Wien in 2014, so also all credits due. In the breaks, you see another work by Barbara Kruger, which is called Untitled Art Forum. And we want to thank Barbara Kruger and Gallery Spruitmagers for being able to use it. Enjoy the break and see you here in the room at 4:30 for crowd-based judgment versus expert judgment, chaired by Elke Boer of Monopol Magazine. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.